She gave me the last of her supper the night I rode into Lodgepole looking like something the wolves had walked past, and she did it without once asking my name. I have lived a long time since, and I have signed papers that moved 100 wagons across 4 territories, and I have shaken the hands of men who could buy and sell whole towns. But if you sat me down on the porch I sit on now, with the years thin behind me and the lamp burning low, and you asked me the one thing that ever turned my life clean around, I would not tell you about contracts or trail bosses or the price of haulage in a hard winter. I would tell you about a bowl of beans and a chair pulled close to a small fire. I was 40 years old that winter and I had not been warm in some time, not the kind of warm that matters. I had built the biggest freight line in the territory out of nothing but stubbornness and a strong back, and I had hauled everything a man can haul through country that did not want me to. And somewhere along that road, I had hauled my own heart into a place I could not haul it back out of. I had buried a wife 11 years before, and a daughter not 2 weeks after her, both of them taken by a fever that swept through Holly's Crossing one August and left half the town in black. After that I rode. I told my men I was scouting routes and inspecting depots and minding the business, and that was true enough. But the truth under the truth was that I could not sit still in a house with 2 empty chairs in it. So I rode the line myself, year on year, in a worn coat and a hat gone shapeless, and the men who didn't know me took me for a saddle tramp, and I let them. There is a kind of grief that prefers to go unrecognized. The storm came down out of Tinder Gap the way storms do up there, all at once and meaning it. I had pushed too late in the day trying to make Lodgepole before dark, and the snow caught me on the open grade above town with the wind driving it flat. By the time I came down the main street, my horse was blowing ice, and I could not feel my own hands on the reins. I was 3 days unshaved. My coat was split at the shoulder, and I had trail mud frozen to me to the knees. I looked, I will not pretend otherwise, like a man you would cross the street to avoid. Lodgepole was a freight town, and freight towns are not soft places, but they will usually put a stranger up for a coin in weather like that. I had coin. What I did not have that night was a face anyone wanted near their fire. I tried the hotel first. The clerk looked me up and down and told me they were full, which the empty board behind him said they were not. I tried the boarding house on the corner, and a woman opened the door 2 inches, looked at the snow caked on me, and shut it again without a word. I tried the saloon, thinking at least to stand near a stove, and the man behind the bar jerked his chin at the door before I had got 3 steps in. "We don't want your kind in here tonight," he said. I had heard it before. A worn coat does a man's talking for him whether the words are true or not. I stood out in that street with the snow filling my collar, and I will tell you I was closer to laughing than to anything else, the bitter kind of laugh, thinking how a man could own 40 wagons and not be worth a place by a stove. I had got my horse to the livery at least. The boy there took my coin and asked no questions of the animal, which is more than the town would do for the rider. And I was standing in the dark beyond the last of the lamplight, trying to decide whether to break into a hay shed and freeze a little slower, when I saw the light. It was a poor light. It came from a low place set back behind the freight yard, a lean-to built against the side of a tumble-down wash-house, with a stovepipe smoking thin and a single window glowing about the color of a candle behind dirty glass. There was a line strung across the front with frozen wash on it, stiff as boards, and a few wash tubs banked in snow. Whoever lived there did the town's laundry, I judged, and lived hard for it. It was the last place in Lodgepole a sensible man would go for charity, because it was plain that whoever was inside had less than nothing to give. I went there. I went there because it was the only door in that whole town that had not yet been shut in my face, and because a man near enough to freezing stops being proud. I knocked, and I heard a small scuffle inside and a child's voice, and then the door opened the width of a hand. She was young. That surprised me somehow. I had expected an old woman, the way you expect the poorest house to hold the oldest person. She could not have been 30. She had a thin face gone sharp with too little eating, and a coil of dark hair coming loose, and a shawl wrapped twice around her against the cold that even her little stove could not keep out. Behind her skirt, a boy of maybe 6 peered out at me with big, solemn eyes. She held a tallow candle up between us, and she looked at me a long moment, at the ice in my beard and the split in my coat, and the way I was shaking that I could not stop, and I waited for the door to close like all the others. It did not close. "You'll catch your death out there," she said, and she stepped back and opened it. I have thought about that more times than I can count. She did not know me. She had every reason in the world to be afraid of me, a big rough man, alone in the dark, with a face the whole town had turned away. She had a child to think of and a roof barely worth the name. By any reckoning, a woman in her place should have barred that door and been right to. But she opened it, and she said, "Coming out of the cold," and that was the first warm thing the world had handed me in a longer while than I want to say. Inside it was one room near enough. There was the little stove, an iron thing no bigger than a bucket, and a rope bed in the corner with a quilt worn near to gauze, and a table that had been a packing crate in another life, and 2 chairs that did not match. A washboard leaned by the door. Everything was poor and everything was clean. That struck me even then, half froze as I was. The poverty in that room had been swept and scrubbed and kept, the way some folks keep their dignity when they have given up keeping anything else. She put me in the chair nearest the stove, the good chair, the one with a back to it, and she took the broken one for herself. She made the boy fetch a blanket off the bed, and she laid it over my shoulders, and her hands when they touched me were rough as a man's from the wash water, all cracked across the knuckles. She set the candle by, and she pried my frozen gloves off my fingers one at a time so I would not tear the skin, and she said nothing the whole while about who I was, or where I'd come from, or what I wanted. She just worked at thawing me out the way she'd have worked at any hard job that had landed in front of her. There was a pot on the stove. I could smell it, beans and a little salt pork, the smell of a meal stretched as far as a meal will go. She took down a bowl. There were 2 bowls in that house, I saw, and a 3rd tin cup that did the work of the missing one, and she ladled it half full and set it in front of me with a spoon. "Eat slow," she said. "You'll be sick if you eat fast on a cold belly." I looked at that bowl and I looked at the boy, who was watching it the way a hungry child watches food, and I understood all at once what she had done. There was not much in that pot. There was, I would have bet my whole line, exactly enough in that pot for a woman and a boy to go to bed not quite empty, and she had given a 1/3 of it to a stranger off the street. "Ma'am," I said, and my voice came out a croak I hardly knew, "I can't take the boy's supper." "He's had his," she said, which was a lie and a kind one, and we both knew it. The boy did not contradict her. He had her way about him already, that gravity, that holding on. "Eat," she said again. "I won't have it said I let a man freeze on my doorstep, whatever the rest of this town's got to say about anything." So I ate. I ate slow as she'd told me, and it was the best food I have ever had in my life, and I have eaten off china in the governor's house since. Halfway through I made out that I was full and could go no further, and I pushed the bowl back toward the boy, and his mother let me, and he fell on it without being told twice, and she looked at the 2 of us across that crate table with something in her face I did not have a name for yet. Relief, maybe. Or the simple, settled look of a person who has done the thing they believe is right and is at peace about the cost. Her name was Cora Mercer. The boy was Sam. Her husband had been a teamster, she told me when I asked. I had got curious by then. Warmth bringing the curiosity back. A good driver named Daniel who'd hired on with one of the freight outfits that ran the Tinder Gap Road, and 3 winters back his wagon had gone off the grade in just such a storm as the one howling outside, team and load and man all down the mountain together. They'd brought what they found of him back to her in the spring. The outfit had paid her nothing. A driver who wrecks a load is a cost, not a widow's claim, the way those men reckoned it. She'd had Sam not a year old and a debt at the store and no people anywhere near, and she had done the only thing a woman alone could do in a town like that. She took in the washing. She scrubbed the trail dust out of every teamster's shirt in Lodgepole and the mud out of every freighter's drawers, and she was paid in pennies and looked down on for it, because there is no work the world holds cheaper than the work that keeps the world clean. A figure, she said, not bitter, just tired, wringing a cloth over the basin while she talked, that a woman who will wash a man's clothes for 2 bits will do most anything, so they don't trouble themselves to be decent about it. The Reverend's wife crosses the street. She said it plain, the way you'd report the weather. Sam doesn't go to the school. They let me know he wasn't wanted after the first week. Said the other children's folks complained. She wrung the cloth harder than it needed. He's a bright boy. He'd shame the lot of them if they'd let him sit. I looked at Sam, who had finished my beans and was lining up 3 buttons and a bent nail on the table in some game of his own, ordering them and reordering them with a frown of great concentration, and I believed her. There was a sharp little mind at work behind those solemn eyes. I slept that night on the floor by the stove, wrapped in the blanket she gave me, which I learned later was one of only 2 in the house, and that she and Sam went short for it. I did not learn that until morning, when I saw the boy's lips a little blue and the woman moving stiff with cold, and I understood that the warmth I'd slept in had been theirs. I have done some hard reckoning in my life over money. I never did a harder one than the reckoning I did that morning, lying on a poor woman's floor in a town that had spat me out, working out exactly how much I owed her, and exactly how little she would ever ask for it. I could have ridden on. The storm had blown itself out by daylight and the road south was open. I had business in 3 towns and men waiting on me and a winter's hauling to set in order. A sensible man, a man with a heart as buried as I told myself mine was, would have left a coin on the table, too much of one, the kind of coin that's really an apology and an escape both, and ridden out before the woman was up, and remembered her now and then on cold nights with a vague good feeling, and done nothing. I did not ride on. I will tell you the truth of why, because it's the truest thing in this whole story. It was the boy. I woke before either of them, the way I always did, and I lay still and watched the light come up gray in that one dirty window, and Sam woke and crept over to the stove to feed it the last of the wood, quiet as he could so as not to wake his mother, a 6-year-old child tending a fire so his mother could sleep a few minutes more in the cold. And he caught me watching, and he did not flinch from me the way the whole town had. He just looked at me steady, and then he held a finger to his lips. Hush, let her sleep. And something in my chest that had been frozen 11 years cracked clean across, and I knew I was not going anywhere. So I made myself useful, which is a thing I have always known how to do. While Cora was still asleep, I split the rest of her wood. There was an axe with a loose head leaning by the door, and I tightened the head with a wedge I whittled, and I split what kindling there was to split and stacked it dry under the eave. The linta had a sag in one corner where a post had rotted, and the whole place leaned with it, and I found a length of cull lumber behind the freight yard fence and sistered the bad post and brought the corner up near to true. By the time she woke and came to the door with Sam at her hip, blinking, I had her roof a hand's breadth higher than it had stood in a year, and a face full of sawdust to show for it. She looked at the wood, and the post, and me, and her face did a thing I would come to know well. It got careful. A woman who has been given charity she did not ask for and made to pay for it in pride learns to be careful of gifts. "I can't pay you for that," she said. "You fed me," I said. "I figured we'd call it square and have something left over for me to owe you." She did not smile, not then, but the careful look eased. "You're a freighter," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd have known the build of my hands the way the road wears a man. Out of work. I let her think so. God forgive me, I let that woman think for a good while yet that I was a freighter out of work, a man down on his luck, no better off than herself. I told myself it was because she'd not have taken my help any other way, and that was true as far as it went. But under it was the old thing, the grief that prefers to go unrecognized, and a new thing besides, a fear I hadn't felt in 11 years, the fear of a man who has found something he wants and is terrified of the wanting. If I told her who I was, everything between us would change in a breath. She would see the line, not the man. The whole town would see it. And I had had enough that winter of being seen as a thing instead of a man, first as a tramp by everyone, and I could not have borne being seen by her as a purse. Out of a hire just now, I said, which was its own kind of careful truth. I do all right. Well, she said, and she pushed her loose hair back with the heel of a chapped hand. There's a barn behind the old Prout place down the row, stands empty. Nobody'll trouble you in it. You're welcome to the stove of an evening, long as you're willing to mind it. She paused. And there's wash to be hauled if you don't think it beneath you. The well's a good way, and I can only carry the one yoke. So that is how I came to stay in Lodgepole. I who had moved freight from the railhead to the silver camps and back, who had cleared more money in a single season than that whole town would see in 10 years, took up hauling wash water for a widow at 2 bits a day she could ill afford and I would not take. I told her to keep it against the rent of the barn. There was no rent on the barn. I'd looked the owner up and he'd left the country 2 years gone and the bank had forgot it. But she did not know that, and the small fiction let her keep her pride, and I had learned by then that her pride was the realest thing she owned, and the thing I least wanted to take from her. I was 3 weeks in Lodgepole before I understood the shape of what was being done to her, and who was doing it. The man's name was Asahel Prine, and he owned the store. He owned a good deal more than the store. He owned the rooms over it that he rented to the railroad men, and he owned the lots most of the town stood on, and through one quiet arrangement and another he held paper on half the merchants up and down that street. He was a small man, neat, with a small dry voice and a way of folding his hands, and he was not a stupid man, which made him worse. The lean-to and the wash-house Cora lived in stood on a lot that Asahel Prine had bought up at a tax sale the year after her husband died, bought it cheap with her standing on it, the way you'd buy the ground out from under a person and call it business, and he had been raising her rent on it by careful degrees ever since, a little each season, never quite enough to break her in one blow, always exactly enough to keep her down at the line where breaking lived. I learned this the way you learn anything in a small town, by hauling wash and keeping my ears open. Prine came around the first of every month for his rent, and he came in person, which a man with his holdings does not do unless he enjoys the doing. I was there the first time I saw it. I was stacking split wood under the eave and Cora was at the tubs, and Prine came up the row in a good coat with his ledger under his arm and his neat dry smile, and he stopped and looked at the corner I'd brought up true, and the new wood, and then at me. "You've a hired man now, Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Things must be looking up." He said it pleasant. Everything that man said he said pleasant. "He's a boarder," Cora said, "in the Prout barn." "Is he?" Prine's eyes went over me, the worn coat, the rough hands, pricing me out the way a man like that prices everything. He found me cheap, which suited me fine, and he turned back to her and opened his ledger. "Well, the first, Mrs. Mercer, and I'm afraid the lot's gone up again, taxes." He named a figure. I saw her face when he named it. I saw what it cost her not to let the figure show on her face, and I saw that she did not quite manage it. "That's near half again what it was at the harvest," she said, very low. "Taxes," he said again, gentle as a man laying a flower on a grave. "I don't make the assessments, Mrs. Mercer. I only pay them and pass them along." He let that sit. Then he said the thing he'd come to say, the thing he came every month to say in one shape or another. "Of course, if it's grown past what the washing'll cover, and I'd understand if it had, a woman alone, I'd not see you put out in the cold. I've a room over the store stands empty. I've spoken before of an arrangement that might suit, keeping house for me, light work, you and the boy'd have a warm place and never want." He smiled his dry, small smile. "You've only to be reasonable." I had been a long time on the freight road, and I have known a great many kinds of men, and I knew exactly what kind this one was, and exactly what that arrangement was, dressed up neat in a ledger and a gentle voice. He did not want a housekeeper. He wanted her under his roof and under his thumb, a poor widow he could call his charity in daylight, and something else when the lamps were out, with no people to speak for her and a town that already held her cheap. He had been at it for 3 years, raising the rent with one hand and offering the room with the other, squeezing her toward the choice he wanted her too desperate to refuse. I had been splitting wood. I set the axe down very slow against the wall, because if I had kept it in my hand, I do not know what I would have done, and that would have been the wrong thing. That would have given the whole game to him in a moment, and Cora would have paid the cost of my temper long after I'd ridden off. So I set the axe down and I said nothing, and I let Cora answer, because it was hers to answer, and a man who steps in front of a woman to do her speaking for her is only another man telling her she can't. She straightened up from the tub. Her hands were red to the wrist, and she had soap to the elbows, and there was steam coming off the water into the cold, so it wreathed around her, and she looked that small, dry man dead in the eye. "I'll have the rent for you on the 1st, Mr. Prine," she said. "All of it. I always have. And I'll thank you to stop speaking to me of that room. I've told you my answer to it every month for 3 years, and it has not changed, and it is not going to change. I'd sooner take Sam and walk to the next territory in the snow." It was a fine thing to watch. It was the finest thing I'd watched in years. Prine's smile thinned just a little. She'd nicked him, calling the room what it was in front of his hired help, which is what he took me for, and he closed his ledger and tucked it under his arm and said, "The 1st, Mrs. Mercer," and went off up the row in his good coat. And Cora stood there a moment with her chest going hard, and then she bent back to the tub and scrubbed like she meant to scrub the hide off a shirt, and I picked up the axe and went back to the wood, and we neither of us said a word. But I want to tell you I had never in my life respected a person the way I respected that woman in that minute. Soap to the elbows and broke to the bone, telling a man who could put her in the snow exactly where he could put his warm room. It was that night, I think, that I stopped lying to myself about what I felt. I had been calling it a debt, a bowl of beans, a blanket given off her own bed, a kindness I meant to repay. I had been telling myself I was a man squaring an account. But you do not lie awake in a cold barn working out the angle of a man's smile because you owe a woman 2 bits. I lay awake working out a Sahel Prime the way I'd work out a freight contract that had a thief somewhere in the figures, and I knew it was not a debt I was minding. It was her. It was the careful look on her face, and the steam in her loose hair, and the boy who tended the fire so she could sleep. 11 years I had carried my heart buried, and a poor woman in a wash-house had gone and dug it up with her bare, cracked hands, and there was no putting it back now. The weeks turned. Winter held hard in the gap. I hauled the wash water and split the wood and fixed every broken thing in that poor place I could lay a hand to, and I taught Sam to whittle, and the boy took to me the way a plant turns to a window. He'd been so long the only man-sized thing in his small world, carrying loads of grief and care no child should carry, and now there was a big rough fellow who'd answer his questions and let him hold the knife, and lift him up to see over the freight yard fence at the wagons. I taught him his letters of an evening by the little stove, drawing them in the ash with a stick of kindling, because it galled me past speaking that a bright boy was kept from the school for the crime of his mother's poverty. He learned them fast. He learned everything fast. He'd say the letters back to me with that solemn frown, and then he'd lean against my arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. And Cora would watch us from the tubs or the table with that look she had, the careful one going soft at the edges, and the room would be warm in a way the little stove had nothing to do with. We talked, Cora and I, those evenings. A man and a woman shut in against a winter find they have a great deal to say. She told me about Daniel, the husband, without grief gone rotten in it, just the clean ache of a good thing lost. He had been kind, she said, and he had laughed easy, and he had promised her a real house with a real floor, and the freight road had killed him for a wage that didn't cover his burying. She told me about the town and the small daily cuts of it, the reverend's wife crossing the street, the storekeeper's daughter who'd been her friend at school and now looked through her like glass. She did not tell it to be pitied. She told it the way you'd tell a man you decided to trust the shape of your life, plainly, trusting him to bear the weight of it without making a fuss. And I told her things. Not the truth, not yet, God help me, not the whole truth. But I told her about my wife and my girl and the fever and the 11 years of riding, and that was a thing I had told no living soul, and she did not say any of the useless things people say. She just listened with her mending in her lap, and when I was done she reached across that crate table and laid her cracked red hand over my big scarred one for a moment, just a moment, and took it back. And that was the whole of it. That was all that ever passed between us that winter that a preacher could have objected to, a hand laid over a hand across a table and taken back. But I have been married since and grown old, and I will tell you there has not been a touch in my whole life that went deeper than that one did. I knew by then I'd have to tell her who I was. A thing built on a fiction can't stand, and I did not want to build anything on sand. But every time I came near it the fear rose up that she'd see the line and not the man, that the easy trust between us would go stiff and careful again, that I'd lose the one warm thing I'd found. So I kept putting it off, the way a coward does, telling myself I'd find the right hour. And while I dithered, the first of the month came round again, and a Sahel Prine came up the row with his ledger, and he had stopped being patient. He'd done his figuring. He'd seen the winter was hard and the wash was thin and the rent he'd raised had finally bitten down to the bone. He came that morning and he did not offer the room. He had got past offering. He laid it out plain in his neat, dry voice. The rent was due, the full of it, and she was $3 short. I knew she was $3 short. She'd been $3 short for a week and saying nothing, eating thinner so Sam wouldn't, and I'd have made it up in a heartbeat, but I knew if I came up with $3 cash out of a tramp's pocket, the whole fiction came down and worse. Prine would smell it. And a debt unpaid was a debt unpaid, and the law was the law, and he was a reasonable man, but he was also a man of business. And unless the full of it was in his hand by sundown, he would have the marshal put her and the boy out. And the lot was his to do it on. Or, he said, and there it was, the same hook in a harder mouth, you can be sensible at last and take the room. I've been more than fair, Mrs. Mercer, more than fair. There's not another man in this town would have carried you this long. He looked around the poor swept room, the worn quilt, the boy in the corner gone still and frightened, and his small, dry voice did not change at all. By sundown, the money or the room, I'd think hard on which. And he went out. I have stood across a table from men with guns in their hands and felt steadier than I felt in that room after a Sahel Prine walked out of it. Cora stood very still by the cold tubs. Sam had come to her and pressed his face into her skirt, and she had her hand on his head, and she was looking at the door Prine had gone out of, and her face was not careful any more. It had gone past careful into something white and quiet and final, the face of a person doing the last hard sum and coming up with nothing left. Cora, I said. He'll do it, she said. He's done it to others. He'll have the marshal here at dark and we'll be in the snow. She drew a breath that shook. I won't take that room, Garrett, whatever he thinks of me. I'd die first, and I mean it as plain as I've ever meant anything. But I don't, and her voice broke for the first time in all those weeks, just once, and she got it back hard. I don't know what to do with Sam, in the snow. I don't know what to do. And I stood there, and the whole foolish fiction I'd built fell down around me. And I saw it for what it was, a thing I'd kept up to spare my own pride, my own grief, my own fear, while a woman I loved ate thin and stood $3 from the cold. I had let her believe I was as poor as she was because I could not stand to be loved for my purse, when the truth was she was being broken for the want of what I had more of than any man in the territory. There is a name for a man who does that, and it is not a kind one, and I called myself every word of it standing in that wash-house. So I told her. I sat her down in the good chair, and I took the broken one for myself, which is a small thing, but I have always remembered I did it, and I told her the truth. I told her my name was Garrett Loomis, and that the Loomis line was mine, every wagon and depot and mule of it, the biggest freight outfit that ran in 4 territories, and that I was not a tramp and never had been, but a man who'd buried his family 11 years gone, and taken to riding his own road in a worn coat because he could not bear to be known. I told her I'd let her believe I was poor because I was afraid. Afraid she'd see the money and not the man. Afraid of the very thing I'd just done by not telling her, which was to let her suffer for my fear. And I told her the last of it, which was the hardest and the simplest, that the warmest I had been in 11 years was on her floor by her little stove, and the gladdest I had been was teaching her boy his letters in the ash, and that I loved her, and that I had been a coward about all of it, and that I was done being a coward now. She did not say anything for a long while. I could not read her face. I had a sick certainty I'd lost her, that the trust was gone, that she'd see me now as one more man who'd come into her life under a false flag, like the town that held her cheap and the man who offered her the room. I would not have blamed her. I sat in that broken chair and waited to be told to get out. When she spoke, her voice was very steady. "You let me give you the boys' supper," she said. "That first night. You let me put my own blanket over you and freeze, and you—" She stopped, and I braced for the rest of it, and the rest of it was not what I'd braced for. "And you split my wood every morning and brought my water and taught Sam his letters when the whole town wouldn't, and you set my roof up true, and you never once let on, and you never once put your hand on me, not once, when you could have made me think I owed it." She looked at me, and her eyes were wet and her chin was up, and she was, I swear to you, half laughing in the middle of crying. "Garrett Loomis, you great fool of a man, you think I cared whether you had $2 or 2,000. I opened my door to you when you didn't have a name worth 2 bits to anyone in this town. I'd open it again. And then, lo, it was never the money I'd have wanted from you anyway." I will not set down here all of what passed in the next while, because some things are a man and a woman's own. But I will tell you I crossed that little room and I took her cracked red hands in my 2 scarred ones, and Sam, who had been watching all of it with his big solemn eyes, came and leaned against the both of us, and we stood there, the 3 of us, in that poor swept room with the cold tubs and the worn quilt, and for the first time in 11 years I was not riding anywhere. I was home. I'd just been a long time finding the door. But there was still a Saho Prine, and there was still sundown. Now I could have settled it with money in a breath. I could have gone up that row and laid Prine's $3 on his counter and 100 more on top, and told him what I thought of him, and that would have been the end of it for Cora. But I had been thinking, in the part of my mind that had run a freight line for 20 years, and I had come to see that money laid quiet on a counter would settle nothing past that one day. Prine would take it and bide and find another turn of the screw, because his power over that town did not come from any one rent. It came from the paper. He held paper on half the street, and he ran his squeeze in the dark where no one could call it what it was, and a man like that you do not beat with $3. You beat him in the light, in front of the whole town that had let him do it, so that it can never be done quietly again. So I did not go to Prine. I went to the freight yard and I found the wire. Lodgepole had a telegraph because it was a freight town, and the operator did not know me from Adam, and he took my coin and my message and asked no questions, though I saw his eyes go wide reading it down. I sent 3 wires that afternoon. The first went to my head man at Holly's Crossing, a Welshman named Price, no kin to Prine, and I have always thought it a fine joke of the Lord's, who had run my line at my shoulder for 15 years and would walk into fire on my word. The second went to my lawyer in the territorial seat. The third went to the man who held the note on a Saho Prine store, who was a banker I had done a great deal of business with over the years, and who owed me a favor or two, and to whom I made an offer for that note that no banker living would have refused. By the time the sun was going down behind Tinder Gap, I had set in motion the thing that would land on a Saho Prine, and I had told no one in Lodgepole a word of it, and I had gone back to the wash house and sat by the little stove and waited for dark with Cora's hand in mine and Sam asleep against my knee. Prine came at full dark, and he brought the marshal just as he'd said. He brought a lantern too, and a lad to carry it, and I have always believed he'd brought the boy along to enjoy the show. He came up the row to the lean-to and he knocked, neat and dry, and Cora opened the door with her chin up and me standing behind her in the firelight, And Prine looked at the two of us, and his small smile did not even flicker, because he thought he held every card there was. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "the money or the room, I take it from your face it's neither, and that you'd rather be stubborn than sensible. A pity. Marshal, I'm afraid this lot's mine, and the rent's 3 days unpaid, and the woman's been told. I'll have to ask you to." "You won't ask the marshal anything," I said, "about this lot or any other lot in this town after tonight." He looked at me then, really looked, the way he hadn't troubled to before, and I watched him try to fit the rough border in the worn coat to the steadiness in my voice and fail to make it come out even. "And who," he said, the dry voice gone a touch less smooth, "are you to say so?" "My name's Garrett Loomis." I let it land. I saw the marshal's head come round. The marshal knew the name. Every man in Freight Country knew the name. I own the Loomis line, and as of about 4 o'clock this afternoon, by wire and by a banker in the territorial seat who was glad of my offer, I own the note on your store, Mr. Prine. Every dollar of it. I expect the paperwork's riding this way on the morning coach, but the banker's word is good and so is mine, and you can put either to the telegraph and check it tonight if you've a mind. I stepped past Cora into the doorway, and I am a big man and I filled it. "So here is how the rest of this goes. You will not put this woman in the snow. You will not raise her rent again, not by a penny, because you will not be her landlord by the end of the week. I'm buying this lot off you at the price you paid for it at that tax sale, which is robbery on robbery and more than you deserve, and you'll sign it gladly, because a man who owes me everything he's got tends to be agreeable. And you will never again, in this town or any other, offer a widow a warm room in exchange for what you offered this one, because I'll be watching, Mr. Prine. The Loomis line touches every town in 4 territories, and I have got a long memory and a great many men, and I have just found a reason to mind what happens in Lodgepole. I want to be honest about it. There was satisfaction in it. A man who's been turned from every door in a town and watched a good woman ground down by a small dry tyrant does not stand above feeling some satisfaction when the wheel comes round. But I tried to keep the satisfaction out of my voice, because it was not for me. It was for her, and a thing done for someone else goes wrong the minute you let it become a thing you do for yourself. Asaho Prine stood in the lantern light a long moment. He was not a stupid man, I've said that, and a not stupid man knows when the ground has gone out from under him entire. He looked at me, and at the marshal who'd taken a careful step back from him, and at Cora standing straight in her own doorway, and I watched him do the cold sum of it and come up, for once in his life, on the losing side. He shut his ledger. He did not bluster. Men like that never do at the end. The bluster is for when they're winning. "I'll want the morning coach's paper before I sign anything," he said, dry to the last. "You'll have it," I said. "Good night, Mr. Prine." And that was the end of Asaho Prine, near enough in this story. He signed the lot over within the week, at the robber's price he'd paid for it, and I gave it to Cora, not sold, not lent, gave in her own name on a clean deed, so that no man living could ever again raise a rent on the ground under her feet. He held his store another year on my sufferance, and then sold it and left the country, the way that kind does when the dark they work in gets a light put to it, and Lodgepole was the cleaner for his going. I have not thought of him in years until tonight. But the part I have thought of, all my life, is the morning after. I had sent that first wire to Price at Holly's Crossing, my Welshman, and in it I had told him to bring the line. Not all of it. A man can't move a whole freight outfit on a whim, but a string of it, a proper string, and to bring it up the Tinder Gap Road and into Lodgepole, and not to spare the teams. I did it partly for the look of the thing, I'll confess. I wanted that town that had turned me from every door and held Cora cheap for 3 years, to see with its own eyes what manner of man it had spat on, and what manner of woman it had let a tyrant grind. But I did it more for her. I wanted Cora Mercer to wake one morning and find that the kindness she'd given a frozen stranger off the street, the bowl of beans and the blanket and the open door, had not vanished into the cold the way kindness so often does in a hard world. I wanted her to see it come back. I wanted her to see it come back so big she could never again doubt that what she'd done that night had been worth the doing. They came up the grade at dawn. I had not told her. I'd told her I loved her, and I'd told her the lot was hers and Prine was beaten. And that was enough joy for one night, and we'd sat up late by the little stove with Sam asleep and not spoken of wagons. So when the sound came down off the gap in the gray morning, that sound, the deep groan and rumble of loaded freight wagons coming down a grade, the chain and the harness and the driver's calls and the great slow thunder of it, Cora came to the door not knowing, with her shawl thrown over her nightdress and Sam at her hip, the way she'd come to the door that first cold night. And she saw them. They filled the road. They filled it from the grade clear down into the town, my wagons, the big Murphy freighters with the Loomis brand burned plain on every side. 10 of them and then 15 and then I lost the counting. The teams steaming in the cold. The drivers up on the boxes in their winter coats. And at the head of it old Price on the gray gelding he favored, with his hat lifted, calling the column down into Lodgepole like he was bringing it home. The whole town had come out into the street in their night clothes to stare. The hotel clerk and the boarding house woman and the saloon man and the reverend's wife who crossed the street, all of them standing in the snow with their mouths open, while the largest freight outfit in the territory came pouring into their little town for no reason any of them could fathom. And the wagons came on down and turned, one after another, and drew up in a great ring in the open ground around the wash house, around Cora's place, around the poorest house in Lodgepole, the linta behind the freight yard, where a widow took in washing and was looked through like glass. They filled her yard with freight wagons until you could not have walked a straight line through them, and the drivers swung down and took off their hats to her, every man, because Price had told them on the road whose door this was and what she'd done. And a freighter understands a kindness given on a cold night better than most men alive. Cora stood in her doorway in her shawl with the steam of all those teams rising around her into the dawn, and she did not say anything at all. She put her free hand over her mouth, and then she turned and looked at me, where I stood behind her with my hand on her shoulder, and there were tears running down her thin, sharp face that had gone past careful for good, and she said the only thing she said, which was my name. "Garrett, you fed a stranger off the street," I said, "when nobody else in this town would open a door to me. You gave me your boy's supper and your own blanket and you asked me nothing." I had to stop and get my own voice back. I was no steadier than she was. "A man pays his debts, Cora. I'm just a freighter. This is the only way I know how." And little Sam, who had been staring at the wagons with his solemn eyes near to falling out of his head, tugged at his mother's shawl and pointed at the great ring of freight wagons filling the yard, the Loomis brand on everyone, and asked in his small, clear voice, the question the whole town was asking, and not one of them had the gall to, "Are they ours?" I knelt down to him in the snow, the way I'd learned to kneel to him over a winter of letters in the ash, and I looked him in the eye, man to man, the way he'd always wanted to be looked at and so seldom was. "They're mine, Sam," I said, "and I aim to be yours if your mother'll have me, so I suppose that makes them yours too in a manner of speaking. You and me will learn the freight business together, after we get your letters finished." And the boy threw his arms around my neck so hard he near put me over in the snow, and over the top of his head I looked up at his mother and I asked her, right there, in front of God and Lodgepole and 40 teamsters with their hats in their hands, I asked her to marry me. Not the room, not an arrangement, not charity dressed up neat. A man asking a woman, plain in the cold, with his whole heart in his throat, the way it should be asked, and the way she had every right to be asked after all she'd borne. She did not answer in words. She came down off her own doorstep into the snow in her bare feet and her nightdress and her shawl, and she took my face in her 2 cracked red hands, those hands that had thawed me out the first night, and she kissed me in front of the whole town, and that was her answer, and there has never been a better one given in this world. We were married within the month in the spring when the gap opened. Not in the Lodgepole church. The Reverend made it known, late and sweating, that we'd be most welcome, now that the news had got round of who the tramp had been, and Cora thanked him with a graciousness I could not have managed and told him we'd be married out of doors. Thank you, on her own land, by a circuit preacher who'd never once crossed a street to avoid her. Half the town came anyway. They came with their hats off and their eyes down, the boarding house woman and the saloon man and the reverend's wife, all of them who'd looked through her like glass, and Cora received every one of them kindly, because she was a better person than I will ever be, and the cruelty had not got into her the way it gets into most. She forgave them their snubbing as easily as she'd fed a stranger, and I think that shamed them more than any wagon ever could. We did not stay in Lodgepole, though I'd given her the lot free and clear. We built a real house at Holly's Crossing, the house I'd not been able to bear to sit in for 11 years, with a real floor like Daniel had promised her, and a room for Sam with a window to the south. And we filled the 2 empty chairs that had run me out of it long ago, and we filled some more besides in the years that came. Sam got his letters and a deal more. He runs the eastern half of the line now, my old freight outfit, runs it better than I ever did. With his mother's gravity and a head for figures that would have shamed a Sahel Prime. He still keeps 3 buttons and a bent nail in a drawer, though he'd not admit to it, and I know why, and that's between him and me. Cora is the one who's gone now this last winter, and that is why the house is quiet and the lamp is low, and an old man sits on a porch telling a story to the dark. We had 30 years and they were good ones, every one. She never lost the way she had of being careful of a thing too easily given, and she never lost the thing under it either, the open door, the bowl shared with whoever came cold to it. We never turned a soul from our gate in 30 years. She wouldn't have it. You came to my door once, she'd say, looking like something the wolves passed over. And she'd smile that smile, the careful one gone all the way soft, and feed whoever it was, and I'd haul their horse to the barn. I have told this story now to my children and my children's children, and I will tell it to you, stranger sitting here in the dark where I can't make out your face any more than that town could make out mine. They say I built the biggest freight line in 4 territories with my own hands, and that's true, I did. But that's not the thing I built that I'm proud of. The thing I built that matters, I built out of a bowl of beans and a borrowed blanket, and a boy who held a finger to his lips so his mother could sleep. A woman who had nothing in this world gave 1/3 of it to a frozen stranger and asked him nothing, not even his name. And I have spent my whole long life since trying to be worth the open door she gave me. I never quite managed it. But I'll tell you this much, and then I'll let the fire go down. There is no fortune a man can pile up in this world worth 1/2 of what that woman handed across a packing crate table on the coldest night of my life. I owned the largest freight line in the territory. She owned the only thing in it that was ever worth a damn, and on the night the whole world turned me away, she gave it to me free. Eat slow, she told me. You'll be sick if you eat fast on a cold belly. I have tried to live the rest of it slow, the way she'd have wanted, and grateful and warm. And I have left a door open every night of my life since, against the chance that somewhere out in the cold there's a man with no name worth 2 bits to anyone, who only needs one soul in a hard town to look at him and say, "You'll catch your death out there," and step back and let him in.